Straight to the issues now. You mark a year in office on the 4th of June. The market has been talking about the lack of liquidity and the lack of lending to the wider economy as still part of the problem that is still prevalent in the economy at this time. What steps are you taking? What steps will you take to unlock credit so the economy grows again?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that the credit crunch is a global phenomenon. You've had it in Europe, you've had it in the US for a long while, and they took their train smashes in 2007. We took our own train smash in the middle of 2009.
True.
Okay, so first of all, what we're seeing is the consequence of a delay in swift action by regulators. There are supply and demand side to credit. When banks lose as much capital as Nigerian banks have lost, and when the balance sheets have been eroded to that extent, it will take time before they have the capacity to lend. And the asset management company, the recapitalization processes, the M&A processes that we are working on are critical to improving the supply of credit.
Right.
But at the same time, we've got to make sure that when the liquidity and capital are back, the banks have credible counterparties in the real economy. Otherwise, there will be a growth in credit, but to go back to asset bubbles in the capital market or the real estate market. So while we're working on the supply side, the reforms that are happening on the power side, the other reforms on energy, on the energy side, and efficient government spending should open up the demand. And hopefully towards the end of the year, we should see an improvement in this.
Now, one of the reforms that you introduced was that all banks had to report their results by AN last year, and we've seen the results coming in. The big question that a lot of market commentators are asking is, have the losses that have been declared by the banks and also the provisions that have been made by the banks been adequate in your eyes? Have we gotten all of the skeletons out of the system?
I think we have, based on present provisional rules. I think also that when we implement the new prudential guidelines, there will actually be improvements in the provisioning position, because we have different rules now for SMEs and infrastructure lending. We also are going to introduce different write-off rules for banks that sell their assets to the AMC. So you will have some capital going back to the books of the banks and improved profitability. What I think people need to be realistic about is their expectations on profits. The banks will remain profitable. The banks will have good returns. But I think the days where banks show extraordinary profits in 1 or 2 years and then go bust the next year are gone, because the nature of the earnings of the banks, given the new regulations we're going to put in, is such that we're going to reduce volatility. But that might also mean people have to be realistic in their, they should get modest returns, and they should be consistent over a long time, but people should not expect the very high casino type returns that they had in the past.
Which suppose brings in the next question, which must mean then that asset prices will remain depressed for quite some time, which should make Nigerian banks attractive for foreigners perhaps that may be looking at. One of the issues that you have said you're going to address is trying to see if we can bring in foreign buyers to come in and buy some of the banks that the central bank took over. How far is that process? Have you had foreign banks knocking at your door and saying, Governor, let us in, we want to buy these banks?
We have opened up a process, and the banks are talking to potential merger partners. They've talked to local banks, they've talked to foreign banks.
Is it all of them or some of them?
They're available to anyone. I think the foreign banks have talked to 2 or 3 of the banks. Some of them have done due diligence. 1 or 2 remain interested. 1 or 2 say, well, look, we would like to wait. And some of the banks are talking to some of the banks that we've not intervened in, so we don't know. But the important thing for us is that we are not stopping foreign banks from coming in. But in terms of solving the problems of the banks either way, we've got partners to do.
Do you have names of the banks that have approached some of the banks in Nigeria that we perhaps can put out there?
No, I have the names, but I will not put them out there.
I wish I could open up your head and look at those names.
I'm sure you would.
Governor, let's move on and talk about the impact of the Greek crisis. Now, as we all know, the Greek crisis has meant commodity prices have plunged, currencies have been very volatile, and that's hurting African economies and African currencies. Now, the question is, I heard that you are considering trying to reduce some of your euro holdings as a way of trying to reduce some of the volatility. How far true is that statement?
The truth is that our reserves are substantially in the dollars at the moment, in US dollars. And one of the things we've got to do is to diversify our reserve holdings. I don't think that we will necessarily take a knee-jerk reaction to what is a short-term measure, but we do have a reserve policy of moving towards diversification.
Can you give us percentages, Governor? In other words, what percentage now is in dollars, and where would you like to move euros to in that kind of
I don't have the exact numbers. I think we, at the moment, about 80% of our reserves are in dollars.
Okay, where would you like that number to be?
It will be a decision taken by the investment committee of the central bank.
Yeah. Finally, Governor, let's talk about the reforms that you're implementing in the Nigerian system. Now, a lot of people have spoken about the problems that are in the system and the work that you've done to try and unlock that. What are the next measures that you're taking to make sure the Nigerian banking scene is clean?
Well, first of all, we've got to conclude the legislation of the AMC, which should happen in the next week or two, and then fix the problems of the banks. And then we've got to make sure that everybody who is involved in the process, the prosecutors, the judiciary, everybody just does what they're supposed to do. I think ultimately what is important is to make sure that when the banks are fixed, they don't go back to what they were doing before. So working on governance, it's an ongoing process. We're working on capacity building, it's an ongoing process. We're also working with the government to ensure that other reforms take hold. Yeah.
Now, finally, last week we saw the U.S. Congress, I think, enact one of the widest sweeping reforms that we've seen in U.S. history. Does that mean that perhaps banks like yours need now to go back to the book and also look at what they can do to bring that in line with what's happening in the rest of the world?
We were actually ahead of America. Before the U.S. government issued its regulation, we had issued our own exposure draft, and that draft actually anticipated a lot of what's going on in the U.S. So we're restricting the use of banks' balance sheets to non-risky behavior, and we're basically reversing the universal banking model.
Absolutely, and you've also held accountable CEOs who transgressed something that the U.S. hasn't done. Governor, thanks very much indeed for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
That's Governor Lamido Sanusi.